Hi, I'm Chris from National Parents Organization, and today we have Dr. Edward Kruk and Dr. Jennifer Harman. They're here to talk about a new paper that they co wrote together called Countering Arguments Against Parental Alienation as a Form of Family Violence and Child Abuse. That paper came out in August, and they'd like to thank the Parental Alienation Study Group for providing some financial support to be able to get this study done. So, Dr. Harman and Dr. Kruk, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks
for
for
having
the
us.
invite.
So let's roll right into this. What was the genesis behind this paper, and how did it get started? Was there a data set that you started from? What was the thought behind getting this paper out? Because it looks like it's going to have a lot of really good arguments in it as to practical things that people can use when they're being blamed for parental alienation.
Mhm. I guess I can start because I took the lead on the paper to begin with, although we worked on it together. Well, I've been studying the whole issue of parental alienations actually since 1985, even though the term had not been coined at that time. And with a study that I did on the kind of loss of contact of non-custodial fathers from their children's lives back in 85, and I've done a lot of work in the field of shared parenting. Some years ago, I published a paper in this very same journal in which this article is published, the American Journal of Family Therapy, on kind of countering some of the arguments against shared parenting as a preferred uh, arrangement, living arrangement for children in the best interest of children and families. And I thought, well, with all this denialism going on about parental alienation now, and it seems the more research we do, the stronger the research and kind of theoretical and empirical foundation for parental alienation. There's been such a pushback with just such a wide range of arguments. You counter one argument and then you're ready to proceed with kind of making a case for addressing parental alienation. There's another argument that sort of comes up, and it's usually in the popular media or in kind of non-referee journals that these arguments appear. So I wrote a short piece in Psychology Today, actually, just outlining 14 arguments and basically citing some research to offset those arguments against parental alienation theory. And I guess just a few people contacted me and suggested, well, why not make this a longer article and really debunk these arguments? And so I thought of Jennifer, of course, because she's been doing most of the work in this area, and we collaborated on it. We kind of identified, the kind of 14 arguments that are out there, and just cited research to clarify what the reality actually is.
And I was happy to help with this project because I have been publishing a lot of research on alienation and parental alienation, and it's been frustrating because no matter how much research we do and how robust the field is becoming, uh, the greater the denial is. The louder voices are denying the existence of any of this research. Um, or people who are publishing about parental alienation, who are critics, fail to even cite any of the research. They pretend it doesn't exist. And which is highly unethical because they know it exists. And so um, I think it's important to, anytime you're dealing with science denial, to call attention to it and call it out. And so that's why I was happy to help work with Edward on this.
So I know a lot of times in divorce, it becomes a he said she said thing typically, and is that what we're talking about here, where somebody is saying, well, they're accusing somebody of parental alienation that isn't really doing it? Is that what the research gets into?
Um, a little, I guess maybe Edward, you could maybe answer that one a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
better than
Well,
me.
that's one of the arguments
Yeah.
that's made. Uh, kind of against the theory of parental alienation, that fathers typically allege parental alienation to deflect attention away from their own perpetration of violence. And courts are, really willing to listen. This is the argument that's made. Courts are, more readily listen to fathers who allege parental alienation than they do to mothers who are saying, well, the reality is that, he's an abuser, and that this is why parental alienation is being alleged. I guess the field of parental alienation, this has been a hot topic within the field for some years. And a lot of research has been done, including Jennifer's research on this topic, telling us that alienating parents are more likely to be abusive parents than the ones who are targeted and perhaps, trying to call them out. And in fact, alienating parents are the ones more likely to make false allegations of family violence. The rate of family violence in child custody kind of disputes is relatively low, in fact. But parental alienation, on the other hand, is actually quite widespread. So we cited that research, and yeah, but we're talking about a context here where people are making false allegations. False allegations of family violence are kind of represent they're referred to as the silver bullet in trying to kind of win a custody case, especially for parents who are seeking, to exclude the other parent from the child's life.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, there's been numerous studies. I've published two, well, three this summer. I published a third paper showing that there's no evidence that dads making allegations of parental alienation are just trying to deflect abuse allegations. Zero. We find no support for that. And that's using 3 different unique samples from the US and Canada. And then Amelie Paquin-Bedreau and colleagues, as a separate group, I found the same results using a different sample from Canada. And I know that there's another paper that will soon probably be published that they find the same thing again. And so these are independent researchers, all independently finding that there is no support for this claim. And the only research that's being used to support the argument that this happens was based on an unpublished study that wasn't reviewed by anybody, that was posted online by Joan Meyer. And so it wasn't refereed, it wasn't reviewed, or even they didn't even incorporate feedback from anybody from the appearances of it. And yet, whenever people talk about this topic who are critics, they only cite that study and none of the other studies that have been published since then. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of people, like Edward said, a lot of people claim abuse, all types of abuse, and it's not often substantiated. So mothers and fathers make claims of abuse. Mothers and fathers make claims of parental alienation. And in the research I've seen so far, across all the studies, there's probably at least 5 that I've looked at recently that have been published on this, some of them including mine. We find that about 30% of the allegations or less are actually substantiated to some extent, whether it's parental alienation or other kinds of abuse. And so it's not that allegations of parental alienation are more common, because moms and dads also make allegations of other kinds of abuse, and they make it false allegations just as commonly as false allegations of parental alienation. And it's not necessarily that people make allegations are doing it maliciously or as a way to gain an advantage. Sometimes parents or their lawyers don't really know what parental alienation is thoroughly, and so they might argue it in court, but they may not recognize that maybe that's not what's actually happening in their case. So sometimes it's education, and it's not being done to harm anyone or being used as a tool. Sometimes it is. We see that for both moms and dads. But it's wrong to just immediately assume that it's weaponized and it's being used only by one gender. When you hear that kind of rhetoric and that kind of extreme statements without lacking in those statements lacking empirical support, your red flag should go up and don't believe the hype. That's
I really like in this paper how you start off, very clearly defining what parental alienation is, and you cite Dr. Burnett's, work in 2020 on that. And but I just want to take a minute, and parental alienation, is pretty a pretty broad term that we throw around quite a bit. So bring me in here, and let's talk about, if you can, introduce sort of lower end of parental alienation all the way to the extreme ends.
well,
Yeah.
I could take this one, Edward, because the definition has evolved a bit, even in the last 10 years, or I guess 12 years since I've been doing research. Edward's been doing it a lot longer, and as in the terminology and our definition changes the more we come to understand it, right? So our understanding of it today is based on the research that's accumulated so far. And what we know about it is that it's an outcome associated with coercively controlling abuse. So if you have a family, regardless of the gender of the coercive controlling person in the family, because we don't find gender differences in domestic violence research or in parental alienation research, because they are one and the same. When that kind of family dynamic is going on, the coercively controlling parent will try to use their child as a weapon against the other parent. And so domestic violence research has documented this behavior for a long time, largely focusing on mothers who do it, but there's been a lot of more recent research showing fathers, who are also, or before it was only looking at fathers, but now we're showing lots of research showing mothers do it too. And when children are weaponized, that's and they internalize. It's not easy to weaponize a kid, right? Because a lot of times children won't even turn against very abusive parents. We know lots of research on children who've been maltreated, neglected, severely abused. They often still love the parent. They still see positive in them. And so it's really hard to make a child really turn on a parent unless this coercively controlling other parent makes them believe that the other parent never loved them, abandoned them, is unsafe or unfit. And if a child starts to finally believe that, then they become alienated. And then that can start early. So in mild parental alienation, the child hasn't fully internalized the negativity yet. They're usually only rejecting their other parent or acting like they don't like them when they're with the coercively controlling parent. But when they're out of their sphere of influence, they love the other parent. Like, they'll spend time with them, they'll transition fine, and they'll have a good time with them. But then as they start to internalize the gaslighting and they fall for the gaslighting of the abusive parent, then they start to believe that the other parent never loved them. And it's like an unrequited love where you love somebody, they don't love you back. People don't react well to that. And for a child, that's even worse because it's half their identity. That's a primary attachment figure. So when they feel like this person doesn't love them, of course they're going to start to feel angry and hurt and, shame and guilt and like all these negative feelings that are too difficult for most people to handle, let alone a child. And so then, yeah, they're going to reject that parent. So you'll start to see rejection. And as it gets more severe, that rejection gets worse and worse. They see that person as the devil and awful, and then they prefer the parent who's abusing them. So they align with their abuser, and then they reject the other good enough parent. That's our current understanding of it. And maybe, Edward, you can add on anything else, but that's my definition. I know it's a long one, but it needs to be because it's a nuanced thing.
Mm-hmm.
And a parent's behaviors don't mean that a child's alienated. Not all kids become alienated. Some kids are able to withstand it. Some always stay in this mild zone, right? Where it's not severe enough and they're still able to weather it. It's still awful for the child, but it doesn't get to the point where they're flat out really rejecting the other parent. Um, and so I think that's sometimes where parents, if the parent is like blocking access or they can't get a hold of their kid when they try to call during a scheduled time, it doesn't mean that the other parent's necessarily trying to alienate them or that they are being alienated. You have to look at what that parent's doing over time and really seeing if they are behaving in a coercively controlling way and using the kid against them as a weapon. That's where you have a danger of alienation.
Mhm. I guess I would, the one thing I'd add to that is that alienation, parental alienation, severe alienation really thrives in the context of high conflict divorces, child custody battles, where one parent is awarded primary residence with the child, or child is kind of with one parent primarily. Uh, we used to call it sole custody. It's referred to more in terms of primary residence now, where the primary custodian decides that the other parent can just be erased from the child's life altogether. And of course, there's no opportunity for the erased or the targeted parent in alienation to really be able to have any positive influence with the child to counter those negative messages. I see parental alienation very much as a form of not only individual abuse, where alienating parents are responsible for their behaviors that are really so toxic, but also a system which not only exacerbates parental alienation. I'm talking about the adversarial sole custody regime, where one parent is given virtually full care and control of children. Not only is that exacerbating alienation, it's a type of collective child abuse, a type of alienation in itself. So um, the other thing I'd add is that yeah, the definition of parental alienation definitely has evolved over the years. I think we've always recognized that there are two main features of alienation, one being the child's kind of unjustified rejection of the target parent and refusal of contact with the parent. And the other one is the alienating parent's use of alienation strategies to denigrate the other parent to kind of lead to that point. Um, but now we have the five-factor model of parental alienation, which I think a lot of the misunderstanding around, or not just misunderstanding, it's actually a lot of the critiques are based on a misunderstanding of what parental alienation is. For example, it's often alleged that, well, alienation proponents, so-called, or those who believe in the reality that this exists and the fact that it's much more widespread than most assume, believe that every time a child rejects a parent or doesn't want to have contact, it's the result of alienation. That's not the position of anyone in the alienation field. It's the five-factor model is really clear that we need to kind of assess each situation on its own merits, and there are many other reasons that a child may kind of reject a parent. But for alienation to occur, there needs to be that refusal of the child or that or indifferent or intense sort of negative feelings or hatred of a parent by a child, or on the other hand, complete indifference to the targeted parent. That's number one. But secondly, there has to have been a prior positive relationship between the targeted parent. It's kind of comes out of the blue. There's thirdly, no history of abuse or neglect or deficient parenting by the targeted parent. And then there have to be these multiple alienating behaviors um, on the part of the alienating parent, and then these behavioral manifestations in the child. So there's quite a list of criteria in the five-factor model for us to kind of be able to diagnose or determine where parental alienation exists and where it doesn't exist. And there's a lot of sort of misuse or lack of recognition of that five-factor model in many of the kind of arguments against the reality of alienation.
Certainly a lot to unpack there. I want to just go back a little bit to, when did we fully realize that parental alienation was in fact child abuse? Because my understanding is we haven't always talked about it that way. In fact, that's kind of a more recent thing. And I think particularly a lot of courts and lawyers and those sorts of things are really struggling to figure out, how do you put this in context? How bad is that as far as, in the spectrum of family violence and those sorts of things. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, maybe I could say a quick word on that to begin. Well, some years ago, my own background is that of, I've been working as a child and family social worker for many years, including child protection, and then working as a professor of child and family social work at the university. And so child abuse has kind of been my field, all along. And some years ago, I wrote an article on kind of, making the case that parental alienation be recognized as a form of child abuse. When you look at the two core components I just mentioned of parental alienation, and that is the sort of the child's rejection and the sort of effects on the child, the negative effects, which are many, from self-hatred to severe kind of psychosocial disturbances, etc. It's a profoundly negative effect on the child. And the second feature are these multiple alienating behaviors on the part of the alienating parent. They coincide exactly with the classic definition of child abuse, that it's the result of human agency, a human action. And here we have a parent really acting in a very toxic way. And secondly, very harmful effects on the child, a severe form of child maltreatment with fairly severe effects. So just looking at the definition of parental alienation, it kind of fits exactly the definition of child abuse. Of course, it's also a form of intimate partner abuse, because the effects of alienation on the target parent are so profound. That was really the first research I did way back in the 80s, looking at the effects of alienation on non-custodial parents who lost contact with their children.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Edward and I started working together. I had read a lot of his work, and so I wanted to write a paper like putting this problem under a larger umbrella of family violence, because family violence incorporates not just child abuse, but spousal abuse and intimate partner violence, not just violence, but also aggression, coercive control. It all falls underneath that umbrella. And the way I saw it is, and the way the research is showing, is that these behaviors are often the coercively controlling behaviors that a parent uses against the other parent sometimes involve the child and sometimes they don't, right? And so, or they're happening all at once, right? They're using the child, but they're also doing lots of other things like stalking the other parent, trying to get them fired from their job, engaging in financial abuse. A lot of those are legislative or legal aggression, right? Forcing. We lost Edward, I think. But the alienating parent will often use a lot of these other types of behaviors in addition to using the child, and so it's part of a larger problem within the family dynamic than just a parent and a child. And so and it's not just, I don't think most parents try to abuse their children. Like I don't think that these
Right.
coercively controlling parents are doing this on purpose to hurt their child or anything, but the children become, proxies for abuse, a weapon to be
Yeah.
used. And when you become a weapon, it has a lot of negative consequences. And then the outcomes for parents and children who are the targets of this coercive control are no different than any other kind of violence. Like in the psychological bulletin paper that Edward and I co-authored with Denise Hines, um, that we clearly demonstrate the parallels between the outcomes we see for alienated children and parents and what we see with other kinds of abuse. Um, so there's evidence within the domestic violence, child abuse research, as well as a lot of the research that's focused only on parental alienation that supports this argument.
So yeah, and when we're talking about parental alienation, I think it's important we distinguish that there's, the recovery from this may be different based on the case, right? Because I think you have some cases where the child never talks to the other parent again ever, right? That's probably the most end extreme, and then you have some where maybe the child, and becomes an adult and realizes that that they were hoodwinked essentially by the other parent, and then they rekindle their connection with the other parent, and I'm assuming you have some cases where it happens before the children become adults. But what's the recovery look like for victims of parental alienation? What I really want the audience to understand is sort of the effects that this really has, and what are the chances of somebody recovering from this?
Mhm. Yeah, there's a great deal of literature on um, therapeutic supports for targeted children, alienated children, and also parents, and also reunification programs. And it's important. I think one point I'd make about intervention is that we address especially severe alienation the same way that we would address any other form of child abuse or child maltreatment. If it's extremely severe, the child needs time away from or needs to be out of the orbit of the alienating and toxic parent. And for reunification efforts to be successful, they need that time and space and to be away from that toxic influence to reunify, and then with the goal, of eventual kind of family intervention to allow the entire family system to kind of reconstitute itself, where both parents have a meaningful role in the child's life, but definitely with less severe forms of alienation, which are actually not infrequent in child custody kind of battles. Um, Intervention that's targeted toward, involving each parent and the child, um, focusing on kind of psychoeducation and counseling aimed at sort of reaffirming the parental identity of the sort of the parent that's targeted or alienated is kind of a preferred method, family support, rather than removing the child from the alienating parent. But yeah, it's really a difficult thing to offer support to affect a kind of reunification, or in the context of court battles where one parent has primary care and control of the child, and really no consequences for excluding the other parent from the child's life, without that kind of buy-in from the court system, without recognizing this as a kind of a child protection issue, and even a criminal matter when it comes to really severe effects on the targeted parent, you know being resulting in kind of complex trauma and sort of severe consequences for the targeted parent. If we don't have that kind of support from social institutions to ensure that both parents are supported in their role, with their responsibilities toward their children's needs, it's really hard to offer meaningful support to targeted parents, especially, and to children.
And I think one of the misinformation that we write about in our paper is that taking children away from the alienating parent or preferred parent is traumatic for them, and so it should be avoided at all costs. And yet, that argument is based on the idea that parental alienation doesn't exist or that it's not severe. And there's no basis for that argument because we know it can be severe, right? And we don't make that argument for any other kind of severe abuse. We don't hesitate to say a child should be taken away from a parent who is physically abusing them horribly, or is severely neglecting them, or is endangering them. We don't have any problems with that. So why is it that a parent who has for years gaslit their child, prevented them from having any contact with their other parent, and psychologically abused them, why do we say that it's traumatic to take them away from a parent who's doing that? That doesn't make any sense. That's saying, oh, well, like they could just, psychological abuse isn't that big of a deal, so they should just stay with that parent. No, is it traumatic? Sure, lots of things are traumatic for people, but it's better we don't hesitate to take people away from a situation where they're powerless and they're being abused. Is it traumatic? Yeah, it's stressful, but you got to take them out of that traumatic situation, otherwise the outcomes are worse. And I think it's also important to understand that when that kind of thing happens, it's only in the most severe cases when everything else has failed. It's usually when the courts or therapists, everybody's tried everything possible. They've warned the abusive parent to stop what they're doing. They've given them timelines. They've given them therapeutic support, which they refuse to access. It's when it's gotten so bad that you have to reverse custody or prohibit contact for a period of time, it has to be really bad for a court to finally order that. And they're often very hesitant to do it until many years have passed. And usually that's when things have gotten so bad, and the prognosis then for those cases, to get to kind of your other question, it's not great because we know really severe abuse, unless the abuser gets help, there's not a good chance of that child getting better unless they're completely blocked from contact with them. If they're going to reintegrate and try to have contact with that abuser again, that person needs to stop what they're doing. And if they don't stop what they're doing, those children need to be protected. Now, a lot of times parents don't go to court, so they don't have they can't afford it, or the court doesn't recognize it. And they're sadly in a position where they have to kind of wait for the child to figure it out. It usually, we don't have a lot of data on how and when. We do know a little bit about some trajectories of some types of children who figure it out, like what turning points have been. Like Dr. Amy Baker's published a great book on that, called Breaking the Ties That Bind. It was based on a qualitative study that she did where she interviewed adults who were alienated as children. There is some new research that's being conducted right now by actually one of my graduate students who's looking at ways to intervene with adults who were alienated as children. But we don't know a lot about it yet. Well, that's an area of research that we really need a lot more information about, because then that can maybe help us find ways to reconnect parents that were excluded from their child's lives because of parental alienation.
Yeah, it seems the more severe the alienation is, the more or the less likely a child will kind of initiate contact in future, kind of independent of any, sort of therapeutic intervention or whatever. The more severe, the worse the prognosis, it seems. I think it is, again, back to the point of recognizing parental alienation as a form of emotional child abuse, and it is usually considered a form of emotional or psychological abuse, which is no less debilitating than other forms of abuse. But it's also very much related to physical, sexual abuse of children and neglect of children. Neglect because, for the alienating parent, it sort of is much less attuned to the child. For them, and the child's needs. For them, their desire to hurt and seek revenge against the target parent is stronger than their love for their child. So they're relatively insensitive to the child's needs, and concerns around neglect are fairly common. Also, we know that children who are kind of psychologically abused in the way they are in alienation situations are much more at risk, significantly more highly at risk of physical and sexual abuse than other children. So, that's kind of a key point to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that aligns with a study that I just published. I think you referenced it earlier with Amanda Sharples, where
Right.
we analyzed data and we found, yeah, that was the alienating parent who's most likely to have other findings of abuse against them, because once you commit one kind of abuse, usually you're committing other kinds as well. It's not just not just one kind. And the reason a lot of these cases look so messy is because the abuser will do everything they can to deflect attention away from their abuse. And so it's really hard when you're only listening to the parents, because it sounds like a he said, she said. But every clinician I know who works in this area says, don't listen to a word the parents say, only look at what they're doing. Because then you can just get away from all this smoke and mirrors and stuff that happens. And when you get down to the bottom of it and you look at who's doing what and when and how long and to what effect, there's your answer.
Mhm.
And don't get caught up with all the, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
he did this, she did this, nobody's listening to me. But you got to look beyond that and look at the actual behavior.
That's some fantastic advice. I know in a lot of these cases, the person that is accusing the other person is often the one that's really doing the bad thing or the bad
Yep.
things, right? And they're they're gaslighting and deflecting and all that sort of stuff. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit on a systemic level. And one of the things that I believe we need to change in our family court system is ex parte orders. I believe they are overly used to a degree where they're almost abused, because it seems like the majority of cases start off with an ex parte order, and that just really starts conflict from the beginning. And so is in the context of somebody goes into court and they want sole custody of the kids for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever, or however long it is, is that the court participating in parental alienation to a degree, or is there a different term for it, or what's your thoughts around how a lot of these divorce cases start off where they're very conflict prone, and the courts, I think, enable that.
Yeah. Well, we do know that jurisdictions that have implemented shared parenting or a joint custody equals shared parenting as the foundation of family law, the rates of parental alienation go down. Neither parent is sort of, in cases where there's a sole custody order made and visitation to the other, both parent, one parent is trying to kind of weaken an already weak relationship that the other parent has, and the other parent is striving to get more time, and the conflict just exacerbates. And so I think in those kind of situations where courts are removing perfectly good parents from the lives of children via sole custody or primary residence orders, that's absolutely a form of alienation. It's forced removal of a loving parent and a capable parent from the life of a child. So I feel quite strongly that the most important intervention is at a systemic level, and that is to put in place a rebuttable legal presumption of shared parenting. The closer to equal time that the child has with each parent, the better the outcomes, both for the child and for both parents, in the form of reduction of conflict and allowing the child meaningful relationships with both parents. And it very much serves as a bulwark against parental alienation. But I see it very much as not only kind of a form of individual child abuse, but a form of collective child abuse, where social institutions like the courts are not supporting both parents in the fulfillment of their parental responsibilities to their children's needs. We very much kind of have adopted a rights-based kind of approach where parental rights are pitted against each other. Some, and at times children's rights pitted against parents' rights, rather than a responsibility to needs based approach where um, courts are kind of accountable in terms of the degree to which they're supporting both parents as loving and actively involved parents in children's lives.
Yeah, I see it similarly. As a social psychologist, I look at kind of whole context. I see things very similar to the way social workers, I think, see things.
Yeah.
But I kind of see like, I mean, any third party can contribute to the alienation, and I mean the courts are a big part of that. They're a powerful part of that, so they can either help or make it worse. And I disagree. I know probably with a lot of advocates that the answer isn't tear down the courts. Like, I don't believe that at all. I don't think that's a solution. The solution is better communication of science in the courtroom, making sure that the experts who are commenting on this are truly experts, and that voir dire is used very carefully, that attorneys thoroughly understand what this is and um, how to prevent misinformation and science denial about this problem from coming into the courtroom and affecting judicial decisions. So we need better science literacy, better education of all the legal professionals and judicial officers, and then maybe training of judges.
Reinforcing what Jen was saying about the fact that we not, just tear down the courts, that they do have an important role to play in the more severe cases, where family violence is an issue of concern, where parental alienation is an issue of concern, where there's been, evidence that of child maltreatment and also a maltreatment or violence against the other parent. But in the great majority of divorces, that isn't the case. Um, and yet, a lot of parents just feel they have no other choice but to, if one parent applies to the court for sole custody, the other parent has no choice but to participate in that forum rather than, a non-adversarial forum like mediation or some kind of negotiation assistance. Um, and I guess my point was that in the great majority of cases where abuse and violence are not issues of concern, that we want to limit judicial discretion as much as possible. No amount of training of judges will bring them up to speed as far as having sufficient knowledge about child development and family dynamics, really complex areas. And as Aristotle said, the best laws are those that limit judicial discretion. I think that we want that judicial discretion to be, minimized for the great majority of cases. And I guess the other point I made is that in so many cases, the more expert litigant, the more, often, the people who succeed in court in kind of getting their points across, and are, thrive in an adversarial forum aren't necessarily the best parents. And it's these parents who are highly distressed, fearful of maybe losing their children, um, who aren't necessarily the most skilled litigants, that they're at a major disadvantage within the adversarial form. So we need a viable alternative to adversarial resolution, and that is a legal presumption of shared parenting, rebuttable only in those violent situations and more extreme situations of abuse, and a network of support services such as family mediation, which provide a viable option to adversarial resolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just added on saying that I wanted to clarify that I was only talking about severe cases where a court would be the only place we really have to go for those things. We need a place like that.
Yeah.
Whereas in mild cases and other cases that more prevention can be just done to try to address conflicts, then we should try to get it out of the court as much as possible, and move to better models that support families and kind of address, kind of like how CPS works with families. If it's a mild or moderate case, you would do more prevention work, more psychoeducation. You would, add in additional services for the families to prevent it from getting worse. And that's what we need to do with this too.
Well, we're just about out of time here. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about? We've had a wonderful discussion today. We'll cover lots and lots of ground. Anything we forgot?
Well, we didn't get too much into some of the arguments in the paper, that it's open access, so anyone can access it and read it and see some of the points that we made. And I think we did our best to cite as much research as we could to kind of back up what we said, but we still had page limits. I mean, we were still restricted in how long we could really write this paper. We could have written a lot more research to support each of our points, but I think at least it's a starting point to at least get the discussion going. I mean, that was our hope, and to bring awareness to people that, you can't believe every argument that's thrown out there. You have to look deeper at what is supporting that argument. And if the argument is based on just arguments of other people, that's not a good basis for an opinion. If your argument or your opinion is based on empirical research that has done research or data to support it, that's a different basis for an opinion. And one, I think it's evidence-based. And that's what we should be making decisions for our families based on evidence, not just people's opinions about what they think is going on. And so I'm hoping that our paper at least can kind of start getting people aware of what some of these arguments are, and that a lot of them don't have any evidence base to them.
Yeah, and the paper is available on the website of the American Journal of Family Therapy, as Jen mentioned. It's open access, meaning that you can download it for free. And each of these 14 arguments is outlined, and we address each argument in some detail. I think we did a pretty good job in citing, close to 100 empirical studies of the, more than 200 over the past couple of decades of empirical studies that have been published on parental alienation. So I think it can be a good guide for people who are going through the process, how to counter some of the arguments against the concept and the theory of parental alienation.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent guide, and especially if somebody is going through, this right now, they can download this article, they can educate themselves, they can give a copy to their lawyer, educate their lawyer, that sort of thing. I think it really sets a wonderful foundation for that. And we will certainly link to the article in the notes of the show here, and make it easy for everybody to find the article. And really appreciate you both coming on today. It's been a fantastic discussion. I wish we had a couple more hours to talk about all this because, like you said, we didn't get too deep into it. But certainly lots of fantastic research here. And I think what you've done is given us a good foundation to start from, and hopefully open up some folks' eyes about this topic.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Yep. And Jen.
You're welcome. Yep. And then where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you after this? Do you have university contacts or that sort of thing?
In my case, edward.kruk@ubc.ca is my email. Feel free to write directly to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And my university email is public. It's JJ Harman, HARMAN, at Colo State, COLO state.edu. And so that's primarily how I could be reached.
Fantastic. Well, again, thanks for coming on, and we really appreciate all the work that you do for everybody in this space, and we look forward to seeing some more of your stuff come out here in the near future.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Very much.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Thanks.